Hello and welcome to my Chessable Move Trainer course on the Najdorf. In this video chapter we will look at all the remaining 6 moves for white that haven't been covered in the other chapters. I named this chapter Odds and Ends because pretty much everything else is to be found here. So after the move e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. What has led to the explosion of these all sorts of odd moves being tried here is the fact that you could say normal other moves failed to produce anything tangible for white. Generally speaking, black is doing great in the Najdorf. So in an attempt to at least obtain practical advantage, as the theoretical one is more than elusive, white players started to employ all sorts of moves, and by all I mean literally all sorts of moves. So in this chapter we will take a look at them one by one. So let's start. Queen d3. You could say it makes sense. It goes around against the typical opening principles that the queen should be developed the last one and with the bishop still in their starting positions. But the move has an idea. The queen can swing easily to the king side, for example, queen g3. And also the move has the idea of basically preventing the typical Najdorf move e5, because after knight f5, bishop f5, e5, white will have a good control over the e4 and d5 squares. So the move is not without an idea. Normally in such cases where the e5 move is less desirable, I have suggested the move e6 instead. At least to my understanding, the move e6 is the next most typical and close to the spirit with the Najdorf, definitely closer in spirit than the g6 alternatives, which would be more dragon-like. Even though, formally speaking, the e6 move characterizes the Scheveningen, but we also saw that the e6 move is played against bishop g5, so the Najdorf player should be familiar with these positions with the small center e6, d6. So in this case, I also propose the move e6. The primary aim here is to go bishop e7 short castle and then decide what to do on the queen side. a4. So now we see that the aim is to white's aim here is to proceed in a positional manner. a4 constraining b5. An alternative is to prevent the king side development by playing queen g3. Now this impedes bishop e7 because g7 is hanging, but allows b5. And after b5, let's say a3, bishop b7, e4 is attacked. Black will eventually finish the development of the king side by g6 and bishop g7 if required. The queen can come to c7, knight d7 with very, very smooth development, whereas white is kind of not entirely sure how to best develop his pieces. After a4, bishop e7. The idea is to castle as fast as possible to avoid these queen g3 ideas. So queen g3, bishop h6 and so on, they can be easily dealt with once short castle has happened, because bishop h6 can be parried by knight e8 and then king h8, pushing the bishop back. So bishop e2, short castle, and a5. Otherwise, black would continue with b6, and after bishop b7, knight bd7 would obtain a very harmonious and good position. From d7, the knight can further go to c5, attack the queen, attack e4, and also the move d5 will be constantly on the agenda. So by a5, white is at least trying to get some concession, in this case fixing the b6 square. And now d5. Students have tried the move knight d7, and this is a perfectly viable way to treat the position. It also makes perfect sense because it covers the b6 square, and later black will attempt to push b6, and after a b6, knight b6, obtain a comfortable queenside play. Of course, before playing b6, black will play queen c7 to cover c6, and then b6, ab, knight b6 with very comfortable queenside play. This is another normal and satisfactory way of treating the position. I have chosen d5 for another reason. I was prompted in a way to explore d5 by white's last move, which was a5. The pawn on a5 does fix the b6 weakness, but also exposes the pawn. So ideas like bishop b4 and knight c6 are possible attacking that pawn. So what happens is that after e5, pushing e5 is not really good, because e5, knight fd7, e5 is hanging, and then after knight c6, both e5, a5 will be hanging. White will be forced to take on c6, but after bc6, black will have a great position with mobile center c5 and so on. Therefore ed5, ed5. Yes, black now has an isolated pawn, but this is not for long, because he will follow up with knight c6, forcing white to take on c6, and then he will have actually a pair of pawns in the center, c6 and d5, and d5 will not be weak. So short castle and knight c6. This is the point. a5 is exposed, and white is forced to take. Unfortunately for white, knight b3 is not really an option, because knight b4 is very, very unpleasant. It will be followed by bishop f5, and c2 will be difficult to defend. Therefore, knight c6, bc, bishop b3, and bishop b4. The pawn is attacked, white is forced to defend it, bishop b6, and now queen e7. This is a very comfortable position for black, very active. The knight will come to d7, harassing the bishop on b6, and white will always have some issues with the a5 pawn. After knight d7, additional ideas are possible, like knight e5, knight c5. If the queen moves from d3, the bishop can come to f5 on an active position. All in all, very comfortable middle game position for black. Queen f3, another sensible move, because at least it's aimed against e5. e5 would be met by knight f5. From f5, the knight will drop back to e3, and then white will obtain excellent control over the d5 square. Therefore, if e5 is not possible, generally we go for e6. Queen f3 has the advantage over queen d3 that it can support expansion on the king side by g4. But there is an additional move, which is bishop e3, and if you look at this, by a transposition, we have arrived at the sort of Scheveningen version of the English attack, where instead of f3, white has played queen f3. So, in the basic knight of position, after bishop e3, had black played e6, and white played queen f3, we would have arrived in this position. Still, the queen on f3 is kind of awkward, even though it has been played, this line has been played several times by Michael Adams. And we will follow the plan that Kasparov played against Adams. And it starts with the move knight bd7. Students have played the move bishop e7, but that does not deal with the threat of g4. Well, while knight d7 does. The point is that if g4 is met by knight e5 and the pawn on g4 is hanging. Therefore, white plays bishop e2. The threat is again g4, because g4 now is possible. Knight e5, the queen moves, and the bishop from e2 defends g4. Therefore, black further prevents it by h5. By now, we should be accustomed to this h5 move, which has become quite common in the Sicilian. And again, the point is to prevent g4. Students have played moves like bishop e7 or b5, b5 just being probably an outright blunder because of e5. But bishop e7 again does not deal with the threat of g4. So pay attention to your opponent's moves and ideas. If you do, then the moves will be easier to understand and play. So bishop e2, the threat is g4, therefore h5. Since g4 is not possible, bishop h5 weakened the g5 square, so white is taking advantage of it by playing bishop g5 and pinning the knight. But now queen a5. You may remember this idea from the bishop g5 chapter, when white was playing queen f3. In a way, the position is similar and probably can arise by some transposition, even though h5 has been played a bit early by black. Students have played bishop e7, and it is a possible move, but queen a5 is a nice, I think, way to drive back the active bishop there. And now perhaps it may help you memorize this line better. The queen ends up on c7, but not before visiting both a5 and b6. So queen a5, bishop d2, threatening a discovered attack, queen b6 hitting b2 and the knight on d4, and after knight b3, queen c7. So what happened is that instead of arriving in one move on c7, black arrived in 3 moves on, with the queen on c7, but along the way drove back and worsened the position of white's pieces. So the knight is no longer on d4 but on b3, and the bishop is no longer on g5 but on d2. So this loss of time was compensated by the worsening of white's position. Now he wants to go with the typical Sicilian play b5 and bishop b7, hence a4, but now if b5 is not possible, b6 is, and black has a very, very comfortable play here. The bishop will come to b7, the knight can come to e5, rook c8, and so on. The development of the king side can be done by bishop e7, or if required, g6, bishop g7. Typical complex Sicilian middle game where black has the smooth, harmonious development. So this was the preferred line by Mickey Adams from quite some time ago. And now let's check the more direct attempt of g4 immediately. The obvious idea is g5. So the suggested move is knight fd7, getting away in time. Knight fd7. Students have tried the move bishop e7, which is a possible move by all means. However, since the knight will anyway be forced to go to d7, keeping the bishop on f8 keeps the option of developing it on g7, where, especially in cases when white castles long, the bishop on g7 will be quite potent. I'm pretty sure you have seen a lot of games in the Dragon where this bishop proves to be the decisive factor. So also in this Scheveningen position, the bishop can be quite powerful on g7 if possible to develop it there. Therefore, it is of practical value to maintain that option and keep it on f8 for the time being. Bear in mind that the move b5 is a blunder, because after e5 white loses black loses material, because both the a8 rook and the f6 knight are attacked. So knight fd7, g5, and now b5. Now this is possible because e5 doesn't attack the knight, so black can deal with it with d5, for example. Now the bishop will come to b7, the knight will probably come to c6, although it's possible to develop it on d7 after knight b6. The rook comes to c8, the queen probably on c7. Very smooth development on the queen side of all the pieces, whereas the bishop stays on f8 for the time being, keeping the option open for g6 and bishop g7. So a3, useful move to prevent the b4 move, which is very often annoying for white, because the knight on c3 cannot easily find another good square. So bishop b7, queen g3, and now knight c6. As I said, it's possible to develop in another way by knight b6, knight 8, d7, but knight c6 is better because it wins the tempo. It attacks the knight on d4. So it wins the tempo for the development. So bishop e3, and now rook c8. The rook is normally the usual square for the rook in the Sicilian, the half-open, semi-open c file, and also the move apart from being a developing move, introduces the typical motive of an exchange sacrifice on c3 after the knight has been removed. Long castle, white continues with the normal development, and now queen c7. It was possible, as some students have tried, to play the move knight c5. It shows good understanding of the position because the move introduces the idea of rook c3. However, going to the other side, knight c5 would be a mistake because after knight db5, we see that the d file is opened and black will lose the knight on c5 because the pawn on d6 is pinned thanks to this rook being on d1. So queen c7 is the move suggested, but like I said, knight c5 is also a good option, introducing the threat of rook c3. f4, controlling the e5 square, so now the knight cannot go to e5, but now c5 is safe because the queen has been removed from the d file. Now black will aim to continue with b4. b4, ab, knight b4, and the knight on b4 will open the h1, a8 diagonal. e4 will be sensitive, and with all these pieces on the queen side, he will have excellent play against the white king. So this Scheveningen setup after queen f3 is quite comfortable and gives black very good counter chances in the middle game. a3. It looks a move that, well, probably people in the past would have never imagined has a right to exist. But it has been played by many people, including the world champion. And its idea, again, is in a way aimed against e5. The point being that after e5, white will play knight f5. And after bishop f5, e5, he will want to put a bishop on c4 to control the d5 square, and the bishop can drop back to a2 if required. So, again, there is some idea with the move. But a3 also indicates that white is not going to push a4 anytime soon, neither to restrict b5 nor to challenge b5. And this means that black's queenside play will be quite comfortable because b5 will not be challenged. Therefore, again, e6, going for the Scheveningen, and then quick b5. White can develop in more than one way. Here, I have decided to explore the more aggressive one with f4. In my analysis, I have always tried to explore and analyze the most aggressive and testing moves, because with the others, less testing, less direct, less aggressive, it is possible to play normally and by common sense and achieve a good position. So f4 is obviously the most aggressive move, with the idea to develop queen f3, bishop d3, and so on along the third rank. b5. It is good to remember that whenever possible in these Scheveningen lines, black aims to develop the queen side first. So whenever possible, b5 first, bishop b7, knight d7. As we saw in the other lines also, the bishop very often remains on f8 because it is not forced to go to e7, and the king is quite safe for the time being in the center. So take care of your queen side first. There's a general rule of thumb. So bishop d3, bishop b7, queen f3, and knight bd7. As I just explained, some students have gone bishop e7, but the rationale is different. Develop your queen side first. The bishop is quite all right on f8, covering g7 just in case, and no need to evacuate the king from the center just yet. So knight d7. Knight d7 also introduces the threat of knight c5 with pressure on d3, on e4, and also helping the d5 move. So d5, e5, knight f, e4. An idea we also saw in the analysis of the in the chapter on bishop g5. Many setups also, of course, not only knight c5, but the knight can go to b6, c4, the queen normally goes to c7, rook c8, the other knight can drop back to d7 and so on. So many possible setups for black, and this richness of possibilities shows that black's position is very reliable, very solid, and offers very good counter chances. g4, threatening g5, so the knight from d7 must move. Knight c5, removing the knight from d7 and liberating that square for the knight from f6. Another idea, a typical one, is the move g6. The move g6 takes better control over f5 and also stops g5, g6 by white. The point is, as I noted earlier, to develop the bishop on g7 where it will be very effective. The fact that the knight ends up on the rim, like this, is of lesser importance because the knight there effectively stops white's kingside attack, so h4, h5 is not possible. And the knight is not forever there, because after an eventual e5, the knight will be useful in controlling the f4 square. This is an additional idea just to mention. But knight c5 is perfectly fine and the preferred way to play. Bishop e3, and now knight fd7. As in the previous line, the knight moves away from f6 in time, not waiting to be chased away by g5. Students have tried the move bishop e7, but as I explained, the possibility to develop it on g7 after g6 is important, so better to keep it. Playing g6 immediately is possible, so g6, bishop g7, that is definitely possible. Rook c8, another possible move, even though then white will just castle long. Yeah? So knight fd7, the most flexible one, just not showing white what black's intentions are, keeping the options open, whether bishop e7, whether bishop g7, whether rook c8, sometimes even long castle. So white continues with long castle, and now queen a5. So now we see another idea. Yeah, the queen could have gone to c7, but on a5 it threatens b4, immediately starting counterplay. Students have tried moves like knight b6 or d5. d5 is outright bad because of e5. Knight b6, again, I'm not really sure if this combination of knights on c5 and b6 is a good one. But queen a5 is a very concrete and nice move to make because the threat immediately is b4. So even though white pushed g4 and developed very nicely along the third rank, etc., it is black who first starts active counterplay and starts the initiative by playing b4. Therefore, this forces white to deal with this threat somehow, and from the start of the middle game, positions black in as the player with the initiative. So all this means that black has an excellent position. Other sixth moves, knight b3. I think this is probably the most, I don't know how to call it. In the comments I wrote shocking, but you can also use other attributes to the move, knight b3, because who on earth would come up with an idea to lose a tempo and remove the best and piece white has in the moment, the centralized knight on d4. So many attacks in the Sicilian have been based on the strength of that knight. And now all of a sudden, and very often there are many lines in the Sicilian where black loses a tempo by playing queen b6, forcing the knight to come back to b3 and then dropping back to c7, or sometimes playing bishop c5, forcing the knight to drop back to b3 and then going back to e7 or a7. So black often, these lines are perfectly theoretically viable with a tempo down for black. And what white does here is voluntarily removing the knight from the center. but this is modern theory. Engines have shown that any move that is not refuted directly has a right to exist. With all this being said, the knight b3 move actually does have an idea, and that idea is in a way a waiting one, you could say. The point is that now e5 is not really desirable, because e5 will be met by bishop g5, and then we have in a way the line with bishop e2, but the bishop still being on f1, and white can use this to his advantage by perhaps going to c4 in one move. So the move is directed against e5. If black goes for dragon development, let's say like g6, then white will also go bishop e3, f3, g4, and so on, transposing to some sort of a dragon with the knight already on g3. Additionally, he can also go bishop e2 and g4 also. So bishop e3, bishop e2, g4. Again, he will not play something tame against a possible dragon development, but will start pushing on the king side as well. Our proposed, and by now common, reaction e6 also shows the idea of knight b3, which is to continue with g4. The point being that now, after the knight being removed from d4, there is no e5 attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on g4 immediately. So e6 blocks the bishop on c8 and allows g4. So as you can see, the move knight b3 is not without an idea, but still this doesn't cease to amaze me that such a move is actually possible. So e6 allowing g4, but in turn getting a comfortable Chevening in position along the lines that we saw previously. So g4, b5. Some students have gone knight fd7, which is encouraging, I would say, because this just shows that they have absorbed the typical idea from the previous lines, where the knight was moving away from the g-pawn. In this case, it's suboptimal, because after bishop g2, b5, okay, maybe a bit, okay, probably also possible, because e5 can be met by d5. Yet again, if you in these Cheveningen positions, as I explained before, it's best if black can play b5 at the first possible opportunity. So bishop g2, bishop b7. So the threat was e5, so the bishop b7, the bishop is developed on b7, exerting pressure on e4, threatening b4. So white is continuing his play g5, knight fd7. The threat is always b4. So in these positions, if possible, if allowed, you should play b4 at the first opportunity. As I mentioned before, b4 disrupts the harmony in white's position, because the knight on c3 will find it difficult to find a stable square. If it goes to a4, it's on the rim and can be easily attacked. Bishop c6, for example, yeah? In this case. If it goes to b1, it just completely disrupts development. If it goes to e2, where does it go from there? So the knight will cause problems to white, because it will fail to find a good square further on. Therefore, if white understands this, he should go a3. So a3 is the best move for white, because, as I explained before, was actually a strategic threat. And now knight c6. Again, the alternative development, knight b6, knight d7 is possible, but why not just speed up the development by putting the knight on c6 immediately? The knights on c6 and d7 have a lot of possibilities from here. To go to e5, to go to d6, to go to a5 perhaps, to support b4. And now h4. An important feature of this line with knight b3 is that if white continues with f4, an important idea for black is the move h6. Why is this important? Well, because h6 undermines the g5 pawn. And white is still not fully developed to support it properly. The point being that if h4, the exchange of rooks effectively eliminates all danger of kingside attack. Black will then just continue developing queen c7, long castle, and will be perfectly safe. And the bishop can be placed on g7 more actively if there is no immediate danger against the d6 pawn. So this idea of h6 is something to be aware of in these positions. And this works best when f4 has been played, because h4, now h6 is less good because gh will kind of force black into some gh disruption of his structure. Therefore, after h4, the move h6 is less desirable, but after f4, it is actually a very, very good move. Its essence, as I said, being prophylactic by reducing the pieces present on the king side. So, therefore, h4 is better. And now bishop e7 can happen. It is also possible to delay the development of the bishop by playing, for example, queen c7 or rook c8 or etc. But bishop e7 is quite alright. And now bishop e3. Of course, white should also speed up his development. He can't continue just playing with the pawns. For example, a typical too much pawn play after f4, for example, would allow knight b6. And now there are many ideas. Knight c4, d5, perhaps. Yeah, b4 also. Rook c8. Many ideas. Therefore, bishop e3. But now the bishop on e3 is vulnerable to attacks from c4. Hence, knight c5. Obviously, f4 before was aimed to prevent knight c5, but that's why we played knight b6, so that the other knight could arrive to c4. Students have tried other moves here, for example, rook c8, which is okay, but not knight d5. That would be bad, because the knight on c6 then is left without prospects. Whereas knight c5 is good, because the knight on d7 has better prospects. It can go to b6, maybe c5 later on. It has better prospects than the knight on c6. Therefore, the knight from c6 should go to e5 and then to c4, because the knight on d7 is the more flexible one. And this position is already very good for black. Many ideas. Like I mentioned, the knight jumps, the queen can come to c7, rook to c8, sacrifices on c3, knight b6, knight c4. Very rich middle game possibilities for black. As for the king, it can stay in the center for the time being. It can go to the queen side if required. Sometimes, if the attack is too strong by black, it can sometimes go to the king side in order to include the h8 rook into the attack. So all in all, a very good, very comfortable middle game for black lies ahead. Next, sixth move, bishop d3. This has very recently been played by Anand at the Grenke tournament against the Vincent Kramer, the young German who qualified to play in the tournament. And it has been played by other players as well. Again, the move is not pretending to achieve any advantage, but it's a solid move, defends the e4 pawn once again, and white will react according to what black does. Okay, black as usual has the choices of e6 Scheveningen, e5 Najdorf style, g6 dragon style, knight c6 also, not determining his options. And here I have decided, because I analyzed it in a bit more detail, here I decided just to stick to the standard Najdorf reaction of e5. So, knight e2. Now we see the idea of bishop d3. It also in a way anticipated e5, because knight now drops back to e2, will go to g3, and we'll aim to take advantage perhaps of the f5 square. But as we will see, the knight on g3 can also turn out to be a bit passive, especially after black takes control of both h5 and f5 squares by playing the g6. So knight e2, bishop e7, continuing with development, short castle, and knight g3. It is possible to play f4, but then it is rather harmless. f4, b5, threatening b4, a3, knight d7, strengthening e5. The bishop comes out to b7 with typical comfortable development. Possible plays to take on f4, possible plays not to take on f4, go knight c5 or go knight b6. Aim to push d5, pressurize e4 after knight c5, etc. Normal Sicilian play for black. So knight g3, this is also what Anand played, and now bishop e6. Bishop e6, not only a developing move, but also move threatening d5. Please note that the immediate d5 would be a blunder, because after e d5, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, the typical trick, bishop h7 wins the queen on d5. Therefore, bishop e6 actually prepares d5. White doesn't really have another way of preventing it, except for jumping there. Again, by now you should probably know the question is always the same, with which piece to take. And here the rationale is a little bit different, because nothing is happening on the queen side, so no threats of a5 or knight a5 happening. But here things are happening on the king side, and taking with the knight, ed, again, bishop d5, bishop h7 is not good, because after queen d5, black will have problems along the light squares. White will have good control over them. So when the bishop draws back, there is this move f4. So black is somewhat lagging behind in development, and this f4 further speeds up white's development, and this activity with the knight now not being that bad at all, threatening knight f5, knight h5 maybe. This initiative is kind of unpleasant. Therefore, bishop d5 is better, and after ed, g6. So by bishop d5, black won a tempo to play g6 and limit this knight on g3. If you look at this knight, you will see that it's not really easy for it to find a good square. So it can, long term, white has this problem how to find a good function, for the knight on g3. Bishop h6, natural move, developing, attacking the rook, rook e8, and c4 defending the pawn on d5 and knight d7. So the structure should be familiar, but there are certain differences here. The difference is obviously the knight on g3. Normally it would be on b3. So with the knight on g3, that means that most of white's pieces are on the king side, and therefore the typical attack that should follow from this structure, before c5, etc., will not be that efficient, because there will be no pieces to support it. On the other hand, these pieces on knight g3, bishop h6, bishop d3 make it a bit more difficult for black to start his own expansion on the in the center and on the king side. So in a way, both sides sort of shifted their priorities. So we will see, for example, in what follows, that black is in turn trying to make use of the c5 square for his knight. The good thing for black is that his king side is absolutely solid. So all these pieces, knight g3, bishop h6, bishop d3, are not really doing anything effective, nor threatening anything against black's king side. So b4. This takes control of the c5 square. So if allowed, black would play knight c5, a5 in typical fashion, and then slowly try to get his pawns going, whether by exchanging first the dark squared bishops, or fianchettoing his own, moving the knight from f6, pushing through f5, making sure that no sacrifices work, etc. So b4 takes control over a5, but now a5. It's a very good move, basically fighting for the c5 square, and also in view of white's next move being forced, because white does not want to allow black absolute control over the c5 square. After a3, black forces exchanges ab, ab, rook a8, queen a8, which diminish white's potential on the queen side even further. And here, he, apart from some sensible moves, he had a very concrete, very strong move, which is the move b5. It is rare that we see this, but this is possible just because white's pieces are on the other side of the board, and black can use his better centralization to destroy this nice phalanx of pawns b4, c4, d5. So b5, the point is to win the d5 pawn. So after, he would definitely take on c4 if allowed, and after cb, knight b6, black has an excellent position. Much better structure, he will return the pawn, he will take on d5, and these doubled pawns are not going anywhere thanks to the strong blockade on b6. This is an excellent position for black already. Let's continue with the next idea. Rook g1. This is kind of blunt. As I wrote, white is thinking, okay, I can't play g4, why can't I just prepare it, not by f3, not by h3, but by rook g1. In a sense, this reminds me of the Keres attack, where the rook usually ends up on g1 and it's useful there, and white, if allowed, does not want to waste time on h3 and then play h4 later, or f3 and then play f4 later, but he's trying to be economical, if possible, to push g4 and then directly, if required, h4 or f4. So not wasting time. Again, it's possible to react in more than one way, and in this case the usual Najdorf idea e5 is more than sufficient, because when the knight moves, the move bishop e6 not only takes control over d5, but in fact makes the actual push d5 inevitable. So black is using the fact that white developed a rook, which had nothing to do with the center, to play his usual Najdorf reaction e5 bishop e6 and push through d5. And the ensuing endgame is problem-free. g4, d5. Students have played bishop e7, but why allow white what he wanted? Bishop e7, g5, and we have some sort of an English attack with rook on g1 instead of f3 being played, but white will continue bishop e3, queen d2, and so on, with double-edged play. But that is not why we played bishop e6 in the first place. We play here, in this line, we played bishop e6 in order to push through d5. Now there are two ways for white, taking on d5 or going g5. g5, obviously, the move is forced, you have to take on e4, knight e4, d4, queen d1, king d1, bishop g2, and bishop g2, and queen c7. Very easy play for black. The king is not at all under any pressure, because c7 is quite a comfortable square. He will continue development. Knight will come to c6. The rook can come to d8. And on the king side, he can try to undermine white's exposed g5 pawn by playing h6. Then a useful thing to remember is that after h6, gh will not be made by gh, but rather by g6, maintaining the solidity of the structure, and then capturing bishop h6. And this in turn will expose the h2 pawn. So the endgame is quite good and promising for black. The alternative ed also leads to an endgame: knight d5, knight d5, queen d5. Queen d5, bishop d5, bishop e3, and knight c6. Natural square, knight c6, the knight is developed, and also opens the possibility of a long castle, which black will immediately take advantage of, because when the bishop is attacked, long castle defends the bishop. What white can do here is to try to temporarily take advantage of his better activity, and he can do that by playing some active forcing moves, and one such move is rook b6, bishop b6, attacking the rook. And now perhaps the move that needs to be remembered is the move rook d6. It may look a bit unnatural because it blocks the bishop, but the bishop can be developed on e7. And also the rook on d6 eyes the bishop on b6, so possible knight jumps are to be considered. The alternative, it may help you to remember the rook d6, because the alternative rook d7 allows some knight c5, and then perhaps black will be forced to give that the bishop pair or play rook d6 then. So then why just not play rook d6 immediately? If bishop c5, the rook can drop back, and the endgame is equal, at least for black, who has a solid structure, good development. So next move, a4. This is one of the more positionally sound moves that white can try on move 6, because its idea is very similar to the positional lines with bishop e2 or bishop e3, and when the knight drops back to f3. The move is more flexible than both, because as we saw in those lines, a4 is a move white makes and is necessary, but then both bishops can go to g5 or c4 in one move without having stopped on e2 or e3 respectively. So the move is in a way a clever one, because white is trying to be economical and in the typical Najdorf structures arising after e5, which is the line I suggest, the idea of the bishops coming to g5 and c4, both the idea being fighting for the d5 square, is rather an economical one. Still, even allowing this economy for white gives black a relative easy Najdorf play, akin to the lines which we considered in the chapters on bishop e2 and bishop e3. So knight f3, obviously not on b3, because the bishop may want to drop to b3. Bishop e7, and now white is at a crossroads. He can start with bishop c4, or he can start with bishop g5. Against both, by now you should know the typical reactions. Bishop c4 is made by bishop e6. Exactly the same reaction as in the bishop e3, 5 knight f3 line. The difference being that here, instead of bishop e3, white has played a4. So bishop e6. And now we see also one of the drawbacks of the a4 move. If, for example, white plays queen e2, then queen c7 would force the exchange of the bishop, because bishop b3 would allow the worsening of the white structure after bishop b3, cb3. Yeah. Or continue with knight d7, knight c5, and the bishop on b3 will again be rather vulnerable. And taking on e6, we already know it's a very comfortable structure after f e6, and followed by castle. The knight can be developed on c6, maybe d7, but if on d7, be careful about knight g5, just to remind you, a very, very good position. And if bishop b3 immediately, then knight d7. Taking on b3 should always be considered carefully, because this exchange leaves the d5 square a bit more vulnerable, with less control. And also sometimes the c-file can be used by white, for example by putting a rook there. So now, therefore knight d7 is quite sensible, because on once the knight arrives on c5, the bishop on b3 will be under attack, because black will then take on b3 with a knight if allowed. Again, bishop e6 is not really a threat, as long as black can defend the pawn on e6 by knight f8, for example. So bishop g5, white is trying to use the economy of the a4 move, so bishop comes to g5 in one move. And now rook c8. If you compare, black is doing basically the same as in the line bishop e3, e5, knight f3, going for quick bishop e6, knight e7, rook c8. Here, students have fallen for the trap. The trap being knight c5, which looks like a natural move to make, but unfortunately this loses by force after bishop f6, bishop f6, bishop e6, f6, the desirable move to cover these squares, but now b4. And the knight has no squares, has to drop back to d7 when queen d7 wins the pawn, and pretty much the game after some play. There is no need to play knight c5 yet, still, as rook c8 is a useful move. After short castle, black is fully developed. No need to worry about bishop e6 now, because the bishop on g5 takes away the g5 square for the knight, so knight g5 is not really a threat. And now, for example, white did what he wanted to do, put the bishop on g5 in one move, put the bishop on c4 in one move, but this didn't bring him any advantage. And even though he managed to put his pieces where he wanted to, now he's kind of devoid of active ideas. For example, rook e1, covering e4, but then h6. And now this forces white basically to take on f6, because otherwise knight c5 can happen. So bishop f6, knight f6. And the position is equal. Black managed to fulfill his idea of when the knights are connected, the knight comes to f6, d5 is well covered, and then he has active possibilities on the queen side. For example, the rook can come to c6, queen to c7, sometimes the queen can go even to a5, rook can come to d8, the rooks can be doubled on the c file. There is also an idea of dropping back the knight back to d7 and then to c5. Also depends what white will do. If bishop e6, f e6 is quite comfortable. Many constructive ideas for black, indicating that he has a very comfortable middle game position here. The other move, so that was the analysis of bishop c4. The other move is bishop g5. And we again should know how to react here. The idea is to take on f6 and put a knight on d5. Therefore, that square needs to be controlled, and needs to be controlled by the bishop. Why the bishop and not knight bd7? Because knight bd7 allows bishop c4 when the bishop will be unopposed on the a2 g8 diagonal. So therefore bishop e6. White continues along the known paths, taking and putting a knight on d5. If you remember, when the knight was on b3, black usually played the move bishop g5. Here, that's not really possible, because then after the exchange, knight c7 is happening and so on. So black continues along with the flexible development, knight d7. As we also saw in that line with bishop e2, e5, knight b3 and bishop g5, the knight is most flexible on d7, because from there not only can go to f6, b6, but also leaves the c file open for the rook. If you remember, there was this very nice maneuver, rook c8, rook c6, which effectively defends the d6 pawn when at the later stages, for example, black starts creating counterplay based on f5. Bishop c4, of course, white's play is based on the control of the light squares and the d5 square in particular. Rook c8 gaining tempo and getting the bishop, attacking the bishop. Queen e2, a useful move, not only defending the bishop but also liberating d1 for the rook. And now a concrete solution to all the problems, which is knight b6. This forces further simplifications. Now everything is under attack, both d5, c4. White is forced to start swapping pieces. So knight f6, queen f6, bishop e6, queen e6. And the position is completely equal. Everything has been exchanged. Black has excellent control over d5. If harassed, the knight can hop back to d7 and f6, from where it will again cover d5. After short castle, black can double on the d file, can attempt to push d5 perhaps, and this is very, very easy. An easy play for black. Following another onto another sixth move, knight f3. I have to admit this is probably even more bizarre than knight b3. If knight b3 at least prepared g4, this doesn't even prepare g4. It has only one idea, if you can discern it, that's the pawn pushed e5. So knight f3 is played with the idea to push e5, and after d, then take on d8, take on e5, and obtain some sort of an endgame. If you understand that the threat is to push e5, and e5 now by black is not desirable because we have the same as the a4 line, but without a4. So then bishop g5, bishop c4 can happen. Again, suboptimal for black. But understanding that the threat is e5, just knight d7 is a normal move. Preventing e5 and putting the knight on the flexible d7 square. It's possible to put it on c6 as well, but d7 is the more usual knight of square for the knight on b8. So it prevents the idea, and now a4. Okay, it's preventing b5, but since white has wasted time on the knight and is not really doing much in the center, black can also take the time and prevent possible a5 and just play b6. Students have played the rather unfavorable move e5, which after bishop c4 would be rather good for black. For white. The bishop is on c4 unopposed. The bishop will come to g5, and white will win the battle for the d5 square. Therefore, it's just easier to play b6, prevent a5, and prepare the development of the bishop on b7. After something like bishop c4, again we know from the Sozin, e6, blunting the bishop. And the next is kind of really straightforward for black. Bishop e7, short castle, bishop b7, and then, according to circumstances, whether rook c8, whether queen c7, whether knight c5, knight d5, pushing through d5, depending how white continues with his development. With already some experience playing the Najdorf, these moves should come naturally, easily, and also the following middle game ideas should also not be too difficult to unearth. Queen e2. Another move which has the idea of preparing a long castle, but one that, unlike queen d3 or queen f3, does not discourage black from playing e5, and black takes the opportunity to do so. So e5, knight f5, we saw that this was the idea, but okay, going back to b3 doesn't make sense, some sort of strange queen e2. So knight f5 and now g6. We mentioned this, that in the line with queen f3, that this was the idea, the knight dropping back to e3 and establishing a good control over d5. But here the problem is a queen on e2, which is very, very awkward. On f3, at least, it wasn't in the way of the bishop, so white could have continued development more easily. But here with the queen on e2, this is all rather awkward. So first bishop e6, controlling the d5. And now g3. White is forced to play in this way in order to develop his king side. And now h5. Perhaps a problem move, but one that is not entirely required, but one which is very annoying for white because it introduces the threat of h4. And then after h4, white will always have to be on his toes whether hg is threatened or h3 is threatened, whether the exchange of rooks favors one or the other. So h4 is a one positional threat, and another positional idea here is the development of the bishop on h6. We already know that in the structures with in these structures e5, d6, it's generally useful for black to exchange the dark squared bishops, because theoretically speaking, it's the worse bishop for black, and the c1 bishop is the better bishop for white, because the light squared bishop on f1 is limited by the pawn on e4, especially when forced to go to the fianchetto position on g2. So h5, bishop g2 and knight c6. Here the knight is developed on c6 because exactly again prompted by the position of the queen on e2. Coming to d4 is coming with a tempo, attacking the queen, centralizing the knight, therefore c6. So the queen is removed from the vulnerable position to d3, but already on move 11 you can see that white had to play moves like queen e2, queen d3, and all these leaves some sort of an awkward impression, which basically means that black is doing quite alright here if white was playing in such a dubious manner. And rook c8. Students have played bishop h6 immediately, which is quite alright, but move rook c8 for the time being leaves the bishop on f8, but also introduces some ideas based on knight d4 and the vulnerability of the c2 square. For example, when the knight jumps to d4, white cannot conveniently jump to d5 because after an exchange there he cannot take with the knight again because c2 would be hanging. So after short castle, now bishop h6. And black has very, very harmonious development, which cannot really be said for white, who has a passive bishop on g2, bishop on c1, which is not going anywhere, and knights on e3 and c3, which do control d5, but then again white doesn't have anything out of that control. And putting a knight on d5 would most likely allow exchanges there, and also exchange of the dark squared bishops, which is in black's favor. Additionally, don't forget that black still has the idea of h4 to start to disturb white's king side. So just even visually it's kind of clear that black has excellent play already in this position. So the last move to consider in this position, h4. Again, one of those shocking moves which were difficult to imagine several years ago, but then again the move has a right to exist. It has been checked with engines, doesn't lose by force, so it is possible to play it. The move is again an aggressive one, waiting for a reaction by black. So g6 lines now, dragon, are less desirable because h5 may happen very fast. Scheveningen lines with e6 are possible, but that allows g4. So in a way, white did not play knight b3 waiting for e6, but played h4 waiting for e6, and which is by far more useful, not only by advancing on the king side, but also in maintaining the knight on the central position on d4. But the typical knight reaction here works well. So e5, knight b3, and again bishop e6. The threat is to push d5, the same as in the rook g1 line. But white here has a way to prevent it by playing f4. So by attacking the e5 pawn, he's preventing the d5 push. And now b5. White has been playing too much with pawns, so he's in no position to take advantage of this b5 by black by attacking it by a4 something, because b4 would be devastating, because e4 will fall and there is nothing on b6 happening, as in, for example, had the bishop been on e3. So black starts immediate counterplay, and here the play quickly becomes very sharp and very interesting. So f5, gaining tempo against the bishop, but now bishop c8. If you remember, there was a line in the English attack where f5 was met by bishop d7, and then later there was a possibility of bishop c6 hitting the weakened e4 pawn, and here we have the same idea, just that instead of going to d7, bishop goes back to the more natural b7 square via c8. So white pushed through f5, gained space on the king side, but at the same time weakened the e4 pawn. So now black wants to continue bishop b7, b4, knight d7, and so on. The line continues in a most aggressive fashion, g4. It's not only that white wants to push to g5, but also liberates g2 for the bishop to defend the e4 pawn. So bishop b7 attacking the pawn, defending the pawn, and now b4. As I have mentioned earlier, black should, again, as a general rule of thumb, b4 should be played as early as possible in a lot of lines in the Najdorf. And this is here even more the case, because b4 forces white to jump to d5, and after an exchange there, knight e5, vd5, a pawn landed on d5, which is generally very favorable for black. Still, the position has some special characteristics, and these are the advanced pawns both for white on the king side and for black on the queen side, and this makes the position even more double-edged. a5. So both sides are just pushing pawns. It looks a bit hyper-modern, but it's also very concrete. a5, the idea is to push a4 and harass the knight on b3, which lacks stability. I would like to show here a possible danger that can happen to black, and why the move a5 is not only a move that wants to harass the knight, but only a move that, but also a move that works tactically. The move bishop e7 may appear as a logical one, because the point of bishop e7 not only to attack g5, but after g5 the point is to play h6 and attack these pawns on g5 and h4, hopefully exchanging rooks. If you remember, we saw this idea in the analysis of the knight b3 line, this h6 move to attack the extended pawn on g5. But here the pawn is not on f4, the pawn is already on f5. So white has the very dangerous move f6, and after gf, queen h5. And just take a look how quickly white's position, white's initiative develops. If black defends in the same way as he would after the main move a5, for example queen c7, there is very strong g6, and after queen c2, gf7, king d8 short castle, white has a winning attack. White hasn't invested any material at all, no sacrifices, and he is a winning attack. The pawn on f7 is a beast. Black's position is simply a mess. Now, compare this to a5. The threat is a4, so this g5, f6 doesn't really work with the bishop on f8, so nothing is happening there for now. And white should prevent black's a4 by playing a3. The point being that after a4, knight d2, b4 will be hanging, and black would actually like to avoid b takes a3, because after rook a3, he can't really say he improved his position on the queen side, whereas white did. The rook is quite good on a3, the knight from d2 can maybe come to c4, e4, and so on. So a3 is in a way a prophylactic move against a4. So now, bishop e7. Now we are seeing already something similar, but there is a difference. And the difference is the inclusion of a5, a3. These tactical justifications based on these details are very difficult to note during the game, so it's always helps if you know them. But they're also very instructive, and it shows the concrete nature of this beloved game of ours called chess. Very, very concrete, and everything depends on the details. So let's continue the line. g5, h6, the familiar idea. Now, if white doesn't continue with f6, black can just take, exchange rooks, put the queen on b6, knight d7, perhaps castle long with excellent play. Some queen h5, queen h8 shouldn't really worry, because bishop can drop back to f8. But the most testing line is of course f6, because we already saw that idea previously, and after gf, queen h5, queen c7, we follow along the same lines, g6, queen c2, gf, king d8. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that this knight is hanging. And that is thanks to the move a3. So the a3 move was a prophylaxis against a4, but who would have imagined that in this sharp line it would actually weaken the knight on b3. So the knight has no defense now. White can ignore it for one move, play bishop e3 with the very nasty threat of bishop b6 check. Of course, white will not allow it, black will not allow it, knight d7 covering b6. Now the knight can drop back to d2, so it's not lost. But after f5 we have a really messy position on the board. Pretty much everything is hanging or is threatened to hang. Many factors are at play in this position. Simply, it's a huge mess. And I think this position of a huge mess is an appropriate way to round up the analysis of these odds and ends, as I call them, various sixth move attempts by white. I hope the lines are, again, easy to understand, to play, to memorize. And of course, I wish you all the best in your future Najdorf games. Hopefully they will bring you much joy and success as they have brought me. Thank you for watching.